Hello, everyone. This is Jimmy Beach. Welcome to this exposure webinar. In today's lesson, we're going to go through editing images with exposure and SnapArt together. And our goal is to understand a bit more about how those things can work together, those two different products, and how we can use them to create something unique and fun. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about what we're using today. And that is, well, first things first, we are going to set aside time at the end for reserving any questions or for answering any questions that you have. We're also watching the chat. So if you guys have a question that you'd like answered, feel free to add it in there and we will get to it if we can immediately. If not, then we'll make sure and get back to it at the Q&A at the end. So I am using exposure, and this is exposure X7, our latest version of exposure, and it is our advanced non-destructive raw photo editor and organizer. It handles an entire processing workflow from organizing images to editing them, and so that's what we're going to do today. I am also going to be using SnapArt, which is another one of the products software in the exposure bundle. So if you bought the exposure bundle on our website, then you already have both of these products installed. The other component of the exposure bundle is below up, and that is for resizing images. So we may delve into that a little bit if we need to today. So let's get into the demo. And today that is going to concentrate on actually doing a little bit of editing before we get into adding effects with SnapArt. So I'm going to move through editing with exposure. Now, I'm going to assume that you guys have a basic understanding of how to use exposure. So I'm going to move a little bit quick with the assumption that you guys know how to work in exposure. Okay. So I'm going to try to point out everything that I do just to make sure that you can follow with me. But yeah, feel free to raise your hand or something if you have a question, or just type it in. So I'm going to go to another folder with some images in it. Here's some beautiful ones from a follower on Instagram that we connected with recently, Alberto. And these are great images because they have very large features in them. Okay. And so when I'm thinking about doing SnapArt effects, I'm thinking about doing something that's painterly that I could use to break down different areas of the shapes in an image to play with the painterly effect, and then other areas that are bold with a lot of color like this, a lot of contrast. So these are some really great images. These will make really cool painting like photos. So let's take one of these images here, and you can see, I'm going to back up to the menu here. Excuse me. It is pollen season here and it's wrecking me down here, everybody. If you look inside of exposure, we're in the grid view, and in the grid view, you can see that there's a plus minus right down here in the corner in each one of these images. That means that I've actually applied some adjustments to these already. And so what I'm going to do is undo all that. So we're starting from the beginning. So I'm going to Command A and we'll select all of those. And then I can hit reset here, or I can hit Command R. Okay, so now these are all back to normal. Oh, now it is telling me that my internet connection is spotty today. So if I am starting to blip in and out, everyone, please just do your best to stay with us, and we will have the recording saved. So, okay, back to our demonstration. Let me talk about what things we want to do to these images before we go and put some painterly effects on them. So we can see here that this one is a little bit dark. Okay. And so we do like that when something is a little bit dark or not exposed all the way, that it does increase the saturation a bit. Okay. It just appears that way. And so if we are going to be increasing our exposure because we want the tones to be better or brighter, then we want to think about what we're going to do in terms of that saturation. Okay. So I'm going to go to the basic panel here. And we can do it the easy way and hit the auto button. However, the auto controls in exposure are typically made for the photo to be, prepared for photo viewing and not for painterly effect viewing. So we can be a little bit more intense and a little bit heavier handed with the adjustments that we apply, knowing that we're going to apply another look to it. Okay. So let's start with clarity. Okay, so brush strokes weaken the image detail on the edges. Okay, so clarity will help. Well, we'll keep the edges, these defined edges here, from blending and bleeding together when we apply those painterly looks to it. So I will grab the clarity slider here and bring that up. Now, if I was doing a portrait, I would not put anywhere close to this amount of clarity, but we can see that as I bring that clarity over, we are getting some more texture coming out on these leaves. Now, also, we can see that we are having some haloing happen around those leaves that normally I would say that's too much. You can see right here. Let's look. Oh, mouse wheel, rogue mouse wheel. Okay, here we go. You can see that if we turn that clarity back down, all of the artifacts that are happening right along this edge, you'll see some like haloing that happens on both sides. Okay, so when you have an extreme amount of clarity, that's kind of what it does. But that's fine for what we're doing, and it's not somebody's face, so we're not really making them look terrible or anything. We do have some blotches of blocked up color in here, but that's totally okay because that's kind of what we're going to go for when we go to a painting. So another thing that we want to do is make sure that we have a lot of saturation because, you know, bold, beautiful colors can really do a lot for the final piece. So there's several options that you have to control colors in your image, okay? Not just the saturation slider. That's kind of the sledgehammer of adding color to your image, okay? And essentially what that does is it just colors everything. It just makes everything more saturated, okay? So a little bit more of a sophisticated way of adding saturation is with the Vibrance slider. I'm going to double click here to reset this. The Vibrance slider will is a little more picky. It's a more of a refined mallet than a sledgehammer in terms of upping saturation. This will only it only grabs or only targets tones that are not oversaturated already, so you don't get as many blocked up colors. Now, speaking of blocked up colors, let us go to another place where we can mess with our colors. Let's turn this Vibrance back down. So if we can see what's happening here is we have a purple tone that has a red in it back here, and then a blue tone here in the photo or in the flower in the back here. And then we have a little bit of that blue up here in the front, but I want to make sure in thinking of my painting that I have some layers. So I'm thinking background layer, foreground layer up here in the front. I hope you guys can see my cursor as I move it around. It'll make more sense in a minute. So let's turn the Vibrance back down a bit. I don't want it that intense. What I want to do instead is use the color panel. Now, when I'm trying to dial in on a specific color in an image or a specific tone, there's other tools that are available aside from these ones on the basic panel. The tools on the basic panel are for doing basic tweaks. If you are more particular about the way that you want something to behave, well, go to another panel because it has other controls and which are sometimes better, especially when you're trying to make like small tweaks to image white balance and stuff like that. Or if your white and black points of your image are way off and you need to expand the, we might actually get into that. I'll show you that later in this demo. Okay, back to where I was in the color. So the color panel has a lot of different features that we have here where we can grab a hold of colors in particular and make them do what we want. So what I wanted to do was take the hue, that's the actual tone of the color, and I'm going to manipulate. Remember how I was saying that this has a little red tone in here and this one has more of a blue tone back here? Well, I want to add more of a blue tone to that one, and I want to add more of a red tone to this one so that I have a little bit more of dynamic color in this image, okay? So I'm going to grab a hold of my color picker because I don't know exactly which tone I want to, it is exactly. This is kind of a purpley pink. So I'll grab a hold of my purpley pink, and I want to drag it the other way, make it a little more pink, okay? That's kind of a lot more pink, but that's fine. And then the other one was the blue one that's back here. And I'm going to grab a hold of that one. And I want to make that one more blue. Okay, that really, okay. Cool. So now I'm paying attention to this one up here in the front. I'm ignoring this stuff back here. So now we have what looks to be a nice tone on our foreground flower. This is the most important thing. I like it. Okay. So we've increased that saturation as well, but we can do it a little bit with a little bit more detail right here. So if we want to, let's say, take the purple tone that we had back in the background and maybe make that one a little darker, it might add a little bit more presence in this foreground right here because that has a mixture of both of those tones. Okay, that's good. So now let's hold down our space or our backslash key so we can see what we've done to this image so far. So before it's kind of a little bit more flat and now it has a lot more color right there in the middle to grab your eye and draw it in. It almost looks like we have a little bit of a color vignette happening by naturally, but we're going to emphasize that a little bit more so that the center of the image has a little bit more saturation than the outside. And I'll show you that trick here in just a sec. So one thing that we can do is we can add a vignette to our image before we bring it into SnapArt. Okay, we're still thinking about doing our painterly look. So let's talk about vignettes. This would be a good time to familiarize yourself with the white vignette or the brighter vignette, right? We actually have some hard edge white vignettes if you wanted to have it kind of do a fade out around the edges here. Sometimes that looks nice. You can take the softness all the way down so that you have a nice, well, not really hard edge, but after the painterly effect is added on there, then you will get some brush strokes that will go off there. And this actually looks pretty cool. I'm not going to do that for this image because as you can see, the subject would be going off of the corner and I don't like that. So let's do a square one instead of a round one. Wrong way. There we go. And then I'll soften that up a bit. And let's make it a little bigger. So what I'm suggesting by doing this, if I'm hoping you guys are picking up on that, is that this will be kind of like the painting at the edges is a little bit brighter, like there's not as much paint at the edges. I tend to, when you're working on a painting, you tend to put a lot more effort and brush strokes into when you're doing detail work. And so that tends to have a more flat paint effect to it, whereas the edges tend to have heavier brush strokes and because you don't spend as much time on it usually, and that's going to be more susceptible to having some bleed through of your base canvas. So that's kind of why I was thinking this way. Okay, so that was a few tweaks. It wasn't all that bad though, but you can tell that I did a lot of adding sharpening, yeah, and saturation to this image that I would not recommend doing because that I wouldn't post that one. Okay. However, it's going to look great. So now we'll open up SnapArt. I think we're ready to go here. I might have another point about this before. Yeah, I do have another point. So I'm going to right click and I will go to edit copy in. And this is an important step. I actually just was chatting with somebody on Facebook about this step here as they didn't understand why they wanted to edit a copy rather than just edit in. And the copy will include all of the edits that we just made to this image in the image that it will open up in SnapArt. So since we've applied some edits to our photo, we put the vignette on there, we put some color tweaks, we did some, saturation too, inside of the basic panel. And so we want to include that stuff. That's why we want to do edit copy in and SnapArt 4. Now, I have this set up so that it will save a TIFF image. That's just what it's set up by default. We can update that if you want to keep it as a JPEG image instead of a TIFF image, and that is in the preferences panel inside of exposure. Why don't I just show you how to do that now? So I hit escape there. Now I'm going to hit escape again. I do have two images here, okay? And you can see this one says TIFF and that one is a JPEG. This was the original image, and then this was the copy we made, okay? So in the preferences panel, I'll pull up the preferences right here. When we're going to external editors, see, that's where I have SnapArt set up. And then it tells me settings for copied images. So I can change that to JPEG right here if I'd like to. So that's where you can do that, right? In the external editors in the preferences panel. Okay. So now I'm going to, now that we had this copy made already, I can just edit this directly in SnapArt and we're fine. So I'll edit in SnapArt. And then it'll open up. I'm going to shrink this down because the recording is not quite the same size as the webinar. Okay, so now we have it open in SnapArt. Let's go through a couple of different looks here. So when you're in SnapArt, a great way to get familiarized is to first go through the effects tour folder. That's kind of where I start, because if you don't have if you don't have an idea as to what you want to do, well, this is kind of the best place because you can look at all of the different looks all together. And so then you can get into some more details about which ones catch your eye. So I'm just going to drag this over here to make the previews a little bit bigger. And then I will look at the thumbnails. So this color pencil look is kind of pretty. I like it a lot when I have when the color tones, it almost looks more pastel, the colors that are in this image now. But when you put the color pencil look on it, I feel like it's that much better. So I feel like that was a good, solid contender. I like the blue mix in here with the crayon look, or crayon, depending on where you're from. And I actually really like playing with these stylized looks a heck of a lot, especially with really large subjects, like a big flower or something like that. Okay, so let's do, for this one, let's do a watercolor look. Okay. So I chose watercolor, and you can see that it softens the image up. So I can hold down the space bar to see the image without the effect applied. So sometimes I do that just to see what causes the different looks in the effect. For example, this darkening of this hole in the background here is from the background showing through, but you can see how it is affecting the area around it. So remember how I was saying that I wanted to make sure that I kept this flower jumping out in the front. So I want to go and look at some other watercolor options. So since we say watercolor is what we're going to do, come down to the watercolor folder. And here are some other varieties of watercolor looks that we can get distracted by that ding. Sorry, that we can take a look at. So you can see that the more colorful options, my eyes are drawn to these automatically. They're just beautiful. I really like how that blue mixes in there. Okay, well, that kind of sold me, I think. And then this one has a strong dark vignette inside of SnapArt, and that kind of adds a cool look, but I already did the white effect here, so I don't want to use that one. And then this one uses a very large brush. Now, if I'm looking at the background, that's not so bad. But I like the color in the colorful one. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to get the best of both of these. So I'll choose the large brush one first, because I think that we're going to build up our look, our painterly look here. So if this is our, let's say it's our first layer, then we'll have that as our background layer of paint, where we want to make sure that the background looks great, and we can always add another layer with more detail to the foreground. Okay, so now I'm going to close this, and we can start at the top. Always good advice here is start at the top and then work your way down through the list of controls. The reason being is that they usually affect each other. So if you start your way at the top, that one would affect the next one, which would affect the next one, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not saying that you have to do them in that order. It's just saying it's a good suggestion. So I actually like the brush size being large like it is, how it's splotchy up here and how we're missing a little bit. So I don't think I need to move that all that much. I can. I tend to move all of the sliders around just a little bit to see what a little bit of change does, even after I see an effect that I like on the screen. So that might be something that you think about. You say, like, if you look here at the number, it says 72. Effect looks pretty good. And I'll drag it up to like 77. I don't know if that's any better. So then we'll drive it to 60 something. And see that I don't like that as much. So definitely higher. So I went 75. There we go. That's kind of what my brain is doing. The background photorealism, that photorealism is going to actually make it have a more sharpening and show you more of the edges. So I'm going to take that down because I want these to blend as brush strokes that we're just implying that there are other flowers behind here. I got to move this. I don't know if you guys can see this thing, but it's annoying me. The zoom title thing there. Anyway, okay. So now, so I like the photorealism the way that it is. I do like the coverage about where it is too, where I can see little bits of that white coming through, because I think that plays in really well with the white vignetting that we put on there. So I might even take it down a little bit more. Let's see, same rules apply. And bring it down, take a look. I like that better. Yeah. Okay. So another thing that you can do too, that I want to point out now, is that there's a randomized seed button down here, and it has a number. So each one of these brush strokes is made randomly, right? And if you hit random seed, it will randomly make a different brush outline or texture. So sometimes if you see something that's, you don't like, it's actually like that, how this looks. But let's say we're concentrating on this highlight down here. If I hit random seed, then that paint down there is going to change so that you can see how the texture is now just a little bit, the brush strokes on it are broken up a little bit differently. Ooh, but I like what it does up here. That looks great. So anyway, random seed's your friend. So take a look at that. Anyway, so stroke length, the longer these strokes are, you can see how these strokes come around here where they're more prominent because of the color change. The longer that they are, it looks a little bit more like, I was going to say color by number, but it mixes it together a little bit more, which I'm not a fan of in my background. I want to see a little bit more of that background. So I'm going to make them a little shorter so they're a little choppier. And the variation of color, that's always a good thing to add in a little bit here and there, because you want to add a little bit more of that splash. But you can see what happens with it, especially since we increased the saturation before. Now we're really going to see what the variation in those tones are going to be showing up here. So I don't want too much of that. It looks pretty good. Okay, so that's kind of the background. That is the background of the look. So now what I want to do is add a little bit. It's going to give me a message up here at the top. And this is talking about the mask tool that we're about to use. Okay, so you can see the brush, and then there's a pin on here. And I'm glad that I highlighted over that. That means that there's already been some brushing applied. So I'm going to delete that area. There we go. Now there's no masking. And you'll notice that there's not a green dot here either. So let me make my brush here, new area. Now you see the green dot. I'll make the brush size a little bit bigger. Oh, that's the wrong thing. These controls now manipulate or change what happens inside of SnapArt, the painterly look. Okay, so notice that the photorealism slider is up and the coverage is up and the stroke length is down. Okay, so these are the controls for the actual brush. I went to the wrong ones. So after I make my brush mask area here, which is what I want, that foreground flower, you'll remember. I don't need to be all that detailed with it, but I do want to be kind of careful. Oh, except for right there where I wasn't careful. Let's fix that. There we go. Better. Okay, so now I have, I'll hover over it. Now I have a mask right here. Going to, what I'm doing here is adjusting the adjustments here. So I want to point something out. You have the brush size and it's 75. Okay. So let's say that I'm going to make an adjustment here. Let's say that we want the brush size big, make it 100. Okay. If I come down and I make a mask and I also want to make the brush size big, well, you can't make 100%, 100%. So think about that. So when you're doing things inside of SnapArt, these adjustments down here are actually making adjustments to the background controls. So we have the brush size around the 70s. That's where we said we liked it. So now if I drag the brush size up to 100, then it's increasing by this much. Or if I drag it down, then I have a lot more to play with and making it smaller. So I hope that makes sense as to how that control is working. We get asked that a lot, so I just wanted to clarify. So what I want to do is make the brush size smaller than what it is here so that I get a little bit better coverage and a little bit cleaner edge. And you'll see that the photorealism slider is up instead of down, which is going to add more details in. So I still want this area right here that I'm working on right now to be this is the focal point. So I need to give it a little bit more, I don't know, strength so that it comes and comes out or jumps out at you. Now, typically color variation is not something I would put in the foreground because it's typically something that people would, it makes things more abstract. So I'd put it back in the background there. Okay. Now, that's looking good. Now let's do one more. I'm going to do another new area. And it is a detail mask. You can see right here in the effect. Man, Paul. Next time I'm going to try to mute it. Sorry. Anyway, I'm going to add another area. And you can see here the brush size is down lower. And I'm going to turn photorealism higher in coverage. And this one's going to be tiny. And the color variation is almost off. So what I'm going to do right here is concentrate on the little middle bits. Oh, that's a minus. Darn it. See, I have it on eraser brush. So I just erased no mask there. All right. So there we go. So now we have our details being brought back there. I hope you guys saw that. So let's hold down our space bar. Yes, so we're getting those details back. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more detail. I'm going to go to the mask on the flower itself. And I want to add a little bit more photorealism to it so that I can see the little bits of lines coming through this way. Just like that, maybe a little bit more. I think that's it. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So now I have three different masks going on. Well, three different effects going on here. Oh, that's background. I should erase that. So I'm going to go to the minus brush, this mask, and I want to get rid of this little bit here. There we go. And see what that did to the background. All right, cool. So now we have our look coming right along. We have the details where we want those details. That's looking great. So there is a colors option here where you can go and choose some presets, which will do some different things inside of SnapArt. Now this is to the SnapArt like painterly effects themselves, which is going to be different than if you did it inside of exposure. This does a little bit different calculation, but similar. Okay. You can add a little bit of brightness to the overall tones on the image, or contrast or saturation. You can also do a little bit of warming or cooling down of the look, which can be very effective for just a little bit of a touch, especially if you're making it look like painting. And so sometimes a little touch of that is nice. You can increase the saturation. It is by default increased a little bit. Okay, so if I hold down the space bar, come on, hold down the space bar. Do it. Maybe it's backslash. Huh. Anyway, hold down the space bar or click my button right now, then you can see the before and after, and we are increasing the saturation a bit. And that's why back here it's real strong. That is okay. But I do really like this thing up here. I think that's looking pretty. So I'm going to say that's okay and leave that as it is. Now, there's a lighting section in SnapArt, and the lighting, because we are using watercolor, we're really not going to have to talk about lighting because watercolor is pretty flat in terms of media. Okay, so we'll come back to it. I'm going to run through another quick version to make another effect here in a second. So let's take a look at our canvas though. Now notice, I'm going to zoom in here. Notice when we look at this, I want you to look at the texture behind the paint. Okay. This looks like watercolor, and it looks like watercolor because this background right here looks like cold press or hot press paper to me. That's probably hot. Oh, it's right there. Duh. It's hot press paper is what I was going to guess anyway. No, actually I was going to say cold. Anyway, but this is paper that you would actually use when you're painting with watercolor. That's why it kind of looks like watercolor. So if we change that over to like canvas, then these two looks sometimes can come together and look good, but you can, if you used a thick or let me find another one here. The default canvas is a little bit more of a, has a little bit more contrast in it. See, the texture is stronger. So if I use a canvas texture like that, when I'm using a painterly look like watercolor, it doesn't quite look right. Okay. It won't be quite as effective, or it won't read quite right, because you typically wouldn't see this type of paint effect on this type of media, if that makes sense. So typically, yeah, the papers and those are the best ones, I think, for the watercolor look. So we'll go back to that. Now, again, this does not have a lot of texture to it. So if I did a whole bunch of like sharp lighting, it is really going to take away from the look that I have here. It's nice and gentle. Okay, so that looks cool. I'm going to save it. And now this is just going to name it, saving it right to the same folder, and it's just going to put SnapArt right after it. So it shows you right here. Okay, so I'll save it to the same folder. And then it'll go there, save out. And remember, this one is a TIFF. That's the one we used. And back inside of exposure here, you can see our images here. Okay. Now, so we have this look, and I know that you're thinking, and that's that, well, that's not as cool and effective as I thought. And that's why we're back in exposure. So there's some other things that we can do to try to, or to add some more depth to our images. That exposure has a lot of tools that you can do that with. And one of them is to control saturation and to, well, I was going to say gray, but I guess that is saturation. Yeah, your gray, add a little bit gray, or take away a little bit of the tones, and it'll read much more dynamically. So we can do some quick things in exposure right now to make this look even cooler. And so I'm going to leave this background alone. Lies. I'm going to leave this foreground alone, and I am going to adjust the background. So we can do a mask with a brush. It's probably pretty simple to do. We might be able to do it with a selection as well. Let's try it. Sometimes in exposure, you just got to go with it and hope it sticks, and just experiment. But it goes pretty quick. So so close, yet not what I was hoping. Ooh, you know what we can do? Let's brush. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to brush because the flower is really small. It's pretty easy to follow that shape. Okay. We'll brush it. And then we'll be sneaky and we'll invert it. There we go. So now we have our effects. Let's close that. That's telling me that I had an empty layer, in case anyone had a question about that. An empty layer just means that I'm not actually applying any adjustments to anything right now, but I have a mask. And exposure just letting me know that I have a mask. So now, if I go to my basic panel, I can take the saturation sledgehammer in the opposite direction and take some of the saturation out. Now, this is not the way that I would do it. So I just wanted to show you that you could. Now, if you do it with the Vibrance, remember that it's going to be selecting all of the tones that are really saturated first. So this is another way, especially like right here in this little crux where there's a lot of vibrant tones. If I pull that down, it's a little smarter about that. But it's kind of making it look muddy, and I'm not caring for that look. So let's delve further in. We can go to the color controls again, and we have all of our saturations. Okay. So if I grab like the shadows and pull a little bit of the tones out of the shadows so that they're a little bit, I'm making the saturation of the shadows less, right? Or I can do it in the midtones, which is a great way of making something look a little bit older. If you take the, just take a little bit, like 10%, 15% out of the midtones. It's a subtle effect, but it works wonders, right? We can do the same thing with the highlights if we want. Here you can see what happens in those background tones. Those are the highlight tones. Okay. So I'm looking for these tones right in here. So I can, yeah, those are the ones I want. Oop. Okay. These ones are fine. So we have a little bit of desaturation happening in here, but you can see that the painterly effect is coming through, and that's what I'm hoping for. Okay, so I already have this mask here, and I'm actually going to clean her up a little bit. Let's there. All I did was just make my brush a little bit smaller. And the reason I'm doing this is because I can see that green being kind of strong around the edges there. Then if I hold down Alt, you go to a minus and I can erase. Cool. Okay, so I'll turn the mask back off. Okay, now I made my look here, and I already made this like really cool mask effect thing. And so this is what's great about using exposure is I've made some adjustments to the background, and I can just right click and oops, I'm going to add a layer, and then I'm just going to copy the mask and paste it and then invert that. So now I have background on the bottom layer, and then I have foreground on the top layer. So now just essentially opposite of what we did on the other panel, we can add our effect to the foreground here, including some more clarity, which will give more of presence to any brush strokes that we added in here, which will make it look like you added some more, well, you spent more time adding details in here. It will also bring the texture of the background up a little bit if it increase it a lot. So you want to watch out for that. Another thing that you can do is you can add sharpening to the effect. Right? Here, let me drag over here. You can add sharpening to the effect, and that sharpening is going to do two things. It's going to increase the edge. You'll be able to see more of the edges inside of the painterly strokes, and you'll be able to see a little bit more of the texture depending on how much you put. So let's add some sharpening. Okay. Now sharpening, if you hold down the Alt button, it turns it gray. Okay, so it turns it gray or black and white so that you can actually see what it's doing. Now, I drag that all the way up and I don't really see anything. And I'm hoping you guys don't see anything either, because that's not doing much. So sharpening in this case isn't going to work from the sharpening panel. We're going to need to use the focus panel. The focus panel has a little stronger effect. It's like the sledgehammer of sledgehammers when it comes to sharpening. The amount goes up to 100. And you can see how much now, all the detail and stuff that's going on inside the image. All that texture is popping, right? So the radius also, you can have a huge radius on the sharpening in the focus panel, right? And so you can see all the texture popping there. And then your threshold is essentially telling it how many of the edges you want it to select to sharpen. So the less that you have, or the more it selects. So the higher it goes, the less it'll select it to sharpen, right? So these type of sharpening effects, I would never use something this strong if it was on a photo, but having it be applied here to this image really adds a lot in terms of some dynamic quality to that photo, making it more painting. Okay, so one more thing that I'm going to do here is make another adjustment to this background, and that is I'm going to bring that vibrance down just a touch. Okay, and you know, another thing that we could do too is probably bring the exposure down. And then I'll bring the exposure of this up a touch. Boop, 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 boop. Not that touch. There. Cool. All right. So we made a look, and then, well, we made some edits, made some adjustments, and then we made our look, and then we made some refinements to our look. So that was kind of a multi-stage process. But it is very effective to play around when you're doing things like this inside of exposure and inside of SnapArt. So now that we've seen the process of it, let me do it again with another image here. We just used this one as our featured as our header images. It's really, really pretty. And this one, I mean, the saturation on it pops already, so I don't really feel like I need to make any adjustments there. It could stand to be a little bit brighter, I'd say. I bet you if I hit, oops, wrong button. Yeah, if I hit auto, that it's going to bring those brights up a little bit, just so that adds a little bit more depth to the flower there, which, because this is a single subject that's large in the photo, again, this is going to make a really good, or a really, excuse me, convincing painterly effect. So we'll add that. And I don't really think that we need much sharpening, but we'll add a little bit. And then I'm going to hold down the Alt button when I drag these. So you can see in the background where it's selecting those edges, I don't want those selected. So when I set which edges with the masking slider and the sharpening, these are the edges I want to apply the sharpening to, just those. And then I can set how big that radius is going to be, and that's going to say how wide the effect is going to actually apply, right? So I want that to be nice and sharp, which it looks great. And then let's do it. We'll go right click, edit, copy in. Ooh, no, we're not. We're going to go to our preferences, just so I show everybody again. And then go to external editors. This time I'm going to use a JPEG image. And I want to bring that to 80. Sometimes if you drag this all the way to high, I feel like it is unneeded. That's just me though. So I'm just going to make it a JPEG. That's it. Now I'll close this. Now, edit, copy, and SnapArt. Okay, now we're in SnapArt. It's going to put the same effect that we just ran through with the other image. Now, that was a watercolor look, and that watercolor look was nice and gentle, and it really did look like, after we made some adjustments to it, it really did look like a painting at the end. So, but this one is much more colorful, so I think we're going to probably end up going more in the impasto with really strong brush strokes, or the oil paint with very thick paint look, just because I think both of those would go really well with this high color. And so let's look at those. Impasto. And we can see the thick paint down here, and you can see the little reflective bits on that. It makes it look like it has a lot of depth to it. And then oil paint does have some of that effect too. It's not quite as strong as the other ones. I'm going to go with this one, abstract. I think that's a work in progress. So here's what we'll do. I'm going to go back because I had masking here. So I'm going to delete until there's no more. And then let's take a little bit of a different approach to this one that we did on the last one, where the last one we dialed in our background first and then added detail. I want to think about what the canvas is going to look like on this one, okay? And so this is a very thick paint. And so because it's a very thick paint, I also want to have a very thick canvas or substrate. Okay, so I'm going to accidentally click cloth, but I didn't mean to. I'm going to do, well, textured is just like, I think that might be what I want. Well, default thick is pretty stout too. And that's like a wide canvas look. So let's go with that one. It's pretty common. It looks good too. And I can actually zoom it to make it look like the, if I want larger texture, like this is, this painting's not huge, you know, if you're going to print it out to like, let's say this is going to be printed on a 12 by, I don't know, 10 by 12 maybe. This size effect here wouldn't be bad for 10 by 12. That one actually looks kind of right. Anyway, okay. So we're thinking about sizing our canvas to what thing we're going to print to is something to think about. Yeah, Elliot, we are. We're recording it. Okay, so let me see here. So our canvas, I like how thick the canvas is, and that's where I'm starting. And the reason I'm starting there is because I've done this in the opposite way, and I feel like the Bernstein Bears dad sometimes, but I've done this the wrong way. And when you do it the wrong way, you get everything set up right with your effects. But if you are planning to have strong canvas, you kind of need to think about it. So it's a good thing to think about at the beginning. Learn from my mistakes, kids. Okay, so now we actually may have some lighting that we could play with, but we can't do that quite because we haven't played with our paint yet. If we have thicker paint, we're going to see the highlights and stuff on the paint. So let's go to our background here and make sure we're happy. So one thing that I don't see happening in the background here is a lot of variation in the colors. And so that's all fine and good, but it does look like the original image in the background if I don't let that variation happen. So obviously, if I put a lot of variation, then you can see that it kind of becomes, this looks more resembles something where you melt wax pens or pencils and let it drip, or you mark it on there with a wet pencil or whatever. I think we can actually have a brush for that. That would be an impasto look. So I'm going to take the color variation down and appreciate the natural tones, but still have a little bit of some splotchiness here and there because we don't want it to completely blend away. I'm going to make the stroke length a little bit longer to allow these the brushing to be a little bit more prevalent in the background. I have the photorealism all the way off, which is totally fine with me. And I think the brush size actually, I might make it a little bigger. Yeah. I'm liking how it looks in the background here and how these things are playing together. And I think that with what's happening here in this flower, we can really make something quick that looks great. So I'm going to add one detail mask. Oops, man, my rogue spinning wheel. Make a mask right there. That was easy. It almost seems too easy. I'll bring it out to the edges. But you'll see that I'm trying to not, if you look where my brush is right here, I'm just holding the button down. You can see where the hard edge of that brush is. And then if you look to the left, I'm looking at the left side of the circle, but if you look to the left, there's the dotted line, and that's the feathering edge. Okay, so that feathering amount, when I'm brushing this in, if you see where I'm staying with my brush, I don't go all the way out to the edge of where I want my mask to stop. And I'm doing that because I want that effect to blend a little bit with the background. That's why I'm doing it this way. So sometimes if you want to, you can go with a smaller brush and do a very detailed mask if you'd like. But I have found that the more detailed I make my masks, the more that I want them to work, even though they might not. So I like to do things quick so that I can trash it and start over if I don't like the way it's going. So, you know, something there. So I want you to notice that we can change the effect of the look. Okay, so right now the effect of the mask is to go to add more detail, but we can make it so that when we put a mask on, we can actually make it more abstract, or that we can change the structure of the paint so that it doesn't line up with the background or something like that if you wanted it to stand out. So that's something to do there. Okay. So another thing that I'm going to do also to this area is add more photorealism, because it has some detail in it, which would be natural to any painting, right? You want to add more detail in, so it gives you something to look at, or it gives you something to look at. And the brush size is small, that works. I'm going to take the paint thickness down, and yeah, it's nice and thick in the background. I was just making sure. And yeah, that looks pretty good. Now I have the brush style on here, and I want you to notice that we can change that. Okay. So if we go to a soft brush, that is the brush style of the mask that we just put on there. Now a soft brush, it has a lot less of the little stroke markings or whatever you can see in the background where you have highlights where it's very thick. This is very refined. And the reason that that works really well for a detailed area like this is the soft brush, and what I'm talking about is that when a painter spends a lot of time making details, you know, detailed painting, they tend to mix that paint together on the canvas. And so it does give a little bit more of a softer brushed look. That's why they named it soft brush. I should be in charge of naming because I'm pretty good at it. Anyway, okay, we have those two things going on here. This looks really great, but we're going to move on and do a little bit of lighting changes. Now I'm zooming in to a place in the image that has my foreground detail and my background, because I want to be able to see them both at once. So these changes here can be incremental, and that would be my recommendation. I would not grab a hold of this and suggest that you drag it up and down, because it's a little bit goes a long way. So if you click inside of it and then click the arrow key up, see, I'm pushing the up arrow key. It's going one dot at a time, or one angle at a time. Now that one angle at a time does a lot of difference. See that? That was one angle degree. See how much brighter it is? So that's why I was saying, like, so be very careful when you're moving these. Now, they're very effective, though. You can see that the canvas now appears that it's filled in the background instead of laying flat, and that the paint itself has filled in a lot of that canvas texture. So this actually works really well with this thick paint effect here. Okay, so I'm going to bring the highlight sizes down a little bit, which will give us more of a sharp look on the edge to the edges of the brush strokes. It also would make it a little bit darker, because when I raised the angle, it made it brighter. Okay. Now, we can add a vignette inside of SnapArt here to our effect. And sometimes that can really work, especially when you have something bright like this on the edge of the frame, or even this little guy down here. So let's do that. We can choose from a bunch of different ones. Pretty much the same controls as you have. You have a little bit more control over them inside of exposure. And so I actually think that I might, let's skip using the vignette in here and instead use the one in exposure. So I'm going to say save to this look. Same thing, I'm using SnapArt after the photo name, and it will render that out, and then we'll take a look at it in exposure. And yeah, I'm thinking in exposure, all I would do is add a little bit of a vignette. And that's it. So let's go. There it is. And then we'll do a vignette. This one. And then I'll just put my location right here. Small, very wee. Perfect. Now, me with vignettes, I typically make vignettes like so heavy handed for a long time. I used to, and now I take them to like below 10, and I always love them. So, anyway, that's just how I do things. But that did a bunch. So, let me hold down the backslash key. Yeah. So now we don't have any tones competing with these tones that are right here in this foreground bit. That's great. That looks really good. Cool. So there goes our lesson today. We went through a couple of different workflows and showed you how you can make some adjustments in exposure, then apply a creative look in SnapArt, and then go back and make some more adjustments in exposure to enhance those looks. And so I'll make a couple more comments. If you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to pipe up now. We'll go into the Q&A after my closeout comments with the conclusion of our demonstration. So yeah, if you want to get in contact with other exposure or SnapArt users, you can do so. And we invite you to over in our, I did not have the URL up, over in our exposure and SnapArt users group. Isn't that nice? See that picture? Another great place is on Instagram. And on Instagram, if you post your images over there, please use our hashtag, #myexposureedit. So that is for images that you've edited in exposure or the exposure bundle. If you've edited them in SnapArt, use SnapArt. All right, everybody. Thanks for your interest and for sticking with us today through this demo. And we'll talk to you next time.